Okay, good evening. Shall we start? So if you can hear me properly, can you give me some response so that I can continue? Okay, thank you very much. Today we'll continue a discussion on the solutions to collective action, which we started the discussion in last lecture. So in last lecture, we argued that multifamily housing involves collective action. And in fact, from the very simple theories on business dynamic, we will expect cooperation, or in other words, collective action, it would not happen naturally. So there must be some kind of cooperative effort we have already engaged so some kind of cooperation is being produced. So we also have sort of mentioned there are 4 different types of collective action solution. One is an individual solution that based on motivation. And then last time we discussed selective incentive and critical mass as 2 of the possible solutions from sort of this perspective. And then it can also be individual solution based on rational expectation. Although we only briefly mentioned that, but the assurance game, the shared norms are also example of that. And of course, the earliest solution to collective action is something what we call coercion. They have been extensively used in early history of human societies, and it's still being used now, but not that extensive. And coercion could be the ultimate and last resort, so the effort for collective action solutions. And then what we are interested more is on collective action that are based on decision-making mechanisms, which last time we discussed about the market solution to that is something what we call the club good. And this lecture, we will discuss another kind of solution, institutional solution, what we call the common pool, so the resources. So last time we introduced 2 concepts before we introduce club good, because we need to differentiate public goods and private goods. And there are, in fact, 2 other kinds of goods that are neither public or private. They are called common goods and club goods. So last time we discussed about club goods. Public goods are those goods that are non-excludable and non-extractable, because of the demand is unlimited. So the incentive in producing such public goods is very little. So usually is the government who need to provide it. Although there is some variation of the provision that will assimilate the effect of market choice on that. So by some public choice economies, so that is the choice of so-called local government by voting with your feet. And there are also other solutions for public goods, because public good, although they exist, but it's not desirable because you need the so-called government provided. So the other 2 solutions is something what we call the club good or a toll good. Club good and toll goods are those goods that are subtractable, so that the enjoyment of one person would not affect the enjoyment of other person. But it is possible to exclude those who haven't paid to enjoy those goods and services, because you have some ways to recover the cost. So it would be possible not to be provided by the government, but by the user of those goods. Although club goods and toll goods are something very similar. Toll goods, a typical example of toll goods is tunnels. So if you use the tunnel, you have to pay. So, but other kind of good is what we call club good. Club good will have a characteristic of the provision of public good within the territory, so that if you can sort of fence off that territory, you're able to collect the charge of that, so as to support the production of those goods. Whereas there are also some common goods. Common goods are those who are not extractable, but you cannot so-called exclude people from using that. So it's excluding those who haven't paid is a problem. So that's what we call a common good. So in fact, this lecture, we will discuss more about that common good, to use so-called what we call the common pool resources approach to provide it. One example of the cup goods is, for instance, cleanliness of the building. So my enjoyment would not affect your enjoyment, because once you clean the outside of the building, of the windows, it is more efficient to clean it all, but not just the window outside your home. And it is possible to exclude your neighbors from using that. So that is what we call a cup good service, because you can have an entrance on that. But another example, for instance, is about tap water. So it's not that popular in Hong Kong, but extremely popular in some cities in mainland China, which the whole development will share just 1 meter, so that it becomes some kind of common good, because you are able to so-called the enjoyment of one person will not affect the enjoyment of others unless you reach a point of congestion. If too many people use at the same time, each will have very little water. But otherwise, if people would not use water at the same time, then your enjoyment would cause little impact on the others. But if you cannot charge individual on that, so there is no incentive for you to save water, and so that the collective bill will be very big, and that is some problem in some older development in mainland China, cities in mainland China. So of course, one solution is, if I can so-called exclude those people who haven't paid, and then I will be able to recover the cost. But of course, one solution, like what we have in Hong Kong, is to install individual meters on that. But unless you have that installed at the very beginning of the building, or otherwise, if you retrospectively install those meters in individual units, that will be very expensive. So that is something what we call common good. So it really happened. Although later on, I'll show what are the typical example of these so-called common goods. So if there is a cup good, that the collective good can be provided within a confined territory, and then you can install a market solution to charge those who use that, or perhaps can also be charged by the quantity of usage, although it's not always possible. So a market solution is a territorial so-called collective good. So it's easier for local public goods that are provided within a particular locality. But it's only possible when you can offer an easy instrument of exclusion. And of course, for the locality, for instance, for a residential neighborhood or for an office building, it's possible because you can control the access to that. And one way of charging the use is to capitalize the public goods. Capitalize the public good is to bring some kind of capital investment up front so that you can make a control on that. One example of the sort of water supply we have mentioned is to install a meter in every household. And then the meter is being controlled by the management of the residential property, for instance. So if you don't pay for your water charge, and then your water supply will be terminated or suspended. So the services provision can be funded either by the capital work of the installation or by how much you use by service charge. So that is a common sort of practice in Hong Kong in those sort of property sort of management fee. And it's also in mainland China as well. There are two models of this territorial provision of public good. One what we call the landlord rental model. The landlord rental model is the services are run by entrepreneurs as a business. They will offer the service, but they will collect the charge. The example, the real-life example are the leasehold system of the UK, which we'll introduce later in this lecture, and also about the DMC manager in Hong Kong. So there is the property management agent, which is appointed by the developer to act as the management agent, so that it collects charge from the user, that's the owners, in return for the property management service. But many of those services, in fact, are not being provided with reference to the quantity of your use, but by some kind of sharing system. The other is what we call association member model, which is what is the same as the landlord rental model. But the exception is, instead of being run by a firm, by an entrepreneur, is being run by an organization that the user shareholders. So later on, that we will introduce another institutional solution, what we call housing cooperation and owners cooperation as an example. So perhaps we will be a little bit confused on that, because these organizations seems to lie in both of sort of this category as a club model of association member model, and also as a common pool resources. Of course, I mean, there's some kind of overlapping between these two. It depends on how you sort of analyze and how you frame sort of those organizations. Although the association member model is being mentioned in the literature in club good, but I would say that it do not fit very well if we compare that with the landlord rental model. So the landlord rental model run by a business firm, by the entrepreneur, is a pure sort of model of that. Whereas the association member model depends on the decision-making mechanism, which we will return later in this lecture. So there are, in Hong Kong, there's a vivid differentiation between them. So if there is so-called no efforts being so-called implemented to solve the collective action dilemma, so those buildings will not have any management or anybody to take care of its daily management. So these are what we call the 3 no buildings. No owners organizations, no property management agent, nor any residents organization. Whereas compared with that is the landlord rental model, which are more popular in Hong Kong and also in mainland China. So you have the DMC manager. Whereas the association member models, I would say that strictly speaking, they should apply only if conceptually we have to make it clear that should only apply to those buildings that are run by the owners themselves. So it's what we call self-management. And that is also a concept being hotly debated in mainland China, whereas they do not appoint a property management agent, but they employ their own sort of property management sort of staff. So I would say that that will be a more genuine association member model. Whereas if you have an association, but you delegate the daily operation to a property management model, I mean, that is a hybrid so-called organization. So it's not purely an association member model. So perhaps we can discuss it more when you run through this topic in your seminar discussion. So of course, Housg solution may not be optimal if the condition in the provision of Housg is not satisfied, because Housg solution is what we call a more theoretical so-called approach to collective action dynamic. They have to fulfill a certain criteria, which in reality may not be that perfect. Take for example, if we cannot impose some kind of device to exclude people who haven't paid in enjoying the service. Of course, that is not difficult, but only if you incorporate that in the planning of the residential development. So there is some way that either you set up an institution as a mandatory requirement, or you have some way that you can control the assets. For those who haven't paid, they cannot even enter the property. So if the cost of exclusion is very high, then the Housg solution may not be that optimal. And also, even if you can set up the exclusive device for those who haven't paid, but whether you are able to include those services that the user need to pay, that is something in academic terms, what we call internalizing the externality. Take for example, a easier to understand solution is pollution. So if we generate pollution, so of course we need to ask those who generate the pollution to pay to keep the emission from polluting the environment, or they need to pay to clean up the environment that have been polluted by them. So that is what we call internalizing the externality. But if we cannot do that, in fact, they are not paying the true cost of the provision. So that can also be translated into housing management. So only if you can control those users who abuse the physical structure or the amenity of the services, or otherwise, if those services are being exploited extensively by a small number of users, so they are not in fact paying the true cost of recovering that. So one example is, for instance, the residence club. I mean, not the same as the club good service concept we have. So many redevelopment, they have a so-called residence club. And for instance, if you have a swimming pool, and if the swimming pool is very expensive to maintain, and then if it is being only used by a small number of residents, and that will not be fair to other residents who do not use the swimming pool. So they are in fact creating some kind of externality because they're exploiting the facilities. So unless we can have some charging system to use the swimming pool, or otherwise that's not fair to share the cost of provision. And also a very important thing is the charging system, whether there are actually choices that the provider of services can choose from. So whether they can impose the charge. I think for an example, if I impose a charge, but there's nothing that I can enforce the payment, then the provision of services or the provision of Housg is meaningless. So of course, you may say that could be very easy with the example of experience in Hong Kong. But in fact, if you take the example in some cities in mainland China, that's not the case, because even if some people, they have a long overdue of this property management fee, but there's nothing the property management agent can do. Of course, I mean, there are some law protecting such so-called non-payment, but that if you bring this to court, in some cities, that is very, very expensive and sometimes even not possible, because the local government do not want those so-called private trouble to interfere with the public so-called judiciary system. So they set a quota on whether the property management agent can bring those so-called non-payment to the court. So that is what we call the choice we have. And even if a covered service is possible to recover the service provision, but in the multifamily buildings or properties, there's also a problem of collective ownership, because there is some decision you have to make on that property, which part of that or the whole of that are collectively owned. And also later on, we'll also mention that in a couple solution, in fact, it's easy to create problem of power imbalance. I'll come back later in this lecture, and also you have another discussion in your seminar on this when we discuss the cup goods. So up to then, up to now, we have so-called have a revision on what we have discussed on the public and private good, and also on the provision of cup goods as a solution to collective action dilemma. But as I mentioned earlier, the cup goods solution is not one solution that fit for all. There are scenarios that the cup goods solution is unable to solve. So that's why we need another kind of solution, what we call a common pool resources, particularly applicable to common good. So multifamily housing is what we call a common pool to resources, because you can for some scenario, you can exclude those who haven't paid for the services to enjoy the service, but only if the instrument for exclusion is possible and not expensive. But in some scenario, it is not that easy, in fact, to impose such a device for exclusion. So that's why we need to contemplate another kind of solution, what we call common pool resources, that will apply to another kind of category of so-called common good we have described. So in the rest of this lecture, we will describe what common pool resources are, and also to fit it into the solution to collective action dilemma. And we'll fit this common pool resources into the functional operation of the management of multifamily housing. And in fact, this so-called institutional solution is unlike the couple solution. It's not just a solution for management. It can also be a solution for ownership, because I just mentioned that. One limitation or one inadequacy of coupled solution is it can solve the problem of provision of management services, but it may not help to solve the problem of collective ownership, which may, such decision on ownership are not the same as the decision on management. So I'll fit this example with so-called a few what we call institutional solution for both ownership and management. So what is common pool resources? Common pool resources are those common goods that are difficult to exclude people, but is highly extractable. So to a certain extent, it is vibrous. But until it reached the point of congestion, the enjoyment of one person may not affect the others. But if there is unlimited demand and limited supply, the point of congestion will easily be reached. So a solution to that common good is not to offer it in the market, but to solve it with organization setup and decision-making mechanism. Example of common pool resources in the literature are so-called open sea fishing. When the supply of fish in the open sea is in an abundant so-called supply, so congestion may not happen, but you should, like what we happen today, and some fish resources have already in the verge of depletion. Water resources for irrigation is also one such example. So you have water in the river. If you can take, you like to take it for irrigation, so you can take whatever you like. But up to the point that if there's no regulations, the supply of water resources is limited. If the user increases, it will come to a point that there is no water can use. So open grassland for herding and also multifamily housing is just an example. So some typical example is the old buildings that have what we call the free node buildings in Hong Kong that nobody invests in the daily maintenance and the provision of services. So it becomes dilapidated very quick. So, but this is very, very expensive to exclude those who haven't paid to enjoy those services. So fish in the open water, they can move. So it is not that possible that you can confine the fish that are yours and so that you can enjoy them. So it's not possible because otherwise the fish will not survive in their natural habitat. Water resources is also such an example. Although water resources is still possible that you build a dam to keep the water, but that will trigger some kind of international dispute because who own the water is always a so-called contentious issue. So those countries at the upstream of the river, if they can set a dam to bar the river, and that will affect country and downstream in using the river. And that's not fair because that should be shared by all the countries along the river. So even if it's possible, but it is not possible technically, but it's not possible politically, in fact, to bar the water and charge people who use that. So open grassland is also just one example. Although open grassland, you can still construct a fence to fence off the grassland, but that will create two problems. One is the cost of constructing the fence is very high. But more important is the ownership of the grassland. So unless you are rich enough to buy the grassland and make it private, or otherwise, those public grassland should benefit everybody, but only if you have some way to control the exploitation of the grass. So that is something similar in multifamily housing, which we will describe it as some kind of urban common goods. So instead of setting a market solution to charge those who pay, there is another approach to that, is to set up an institution to organize the collective action solution. So we are going to discuss such institution and how they operate in practice and what are the problems they have. So when we mention that we will set up an institution to control the use, there are in fact two contexts we need to mention. The first, we just mentioned about the cost of controlling the assets. That may not be that possible or too expensive, but technically or financially, it can be solved. But more important and more significant, in fact, is about the ownership. Because if you fence off or you fence off those so-called area, or you construct a device to exclude people who haven't paid to that will involve an issue of ownership, as I just mentioned. Like water for irrigation in a natural river. So politically, it's not possible because you cannot claim you own the river, even if you are on upstream of the river, because under some kind of international convention of understanding, the river should be shared by countries who are at the two sides of the river. So there are also similar problems for open grassland. So if the open grassland is public, so anybody who wants to buy that and set up the provision of a cupboard may be opposed by those who traditionally or conventionally use the grassland for herding. Because that is also a political issue. So it happened in many developing countries. There's some big corporation, either local or from overseas, they buy off a big piece of land. Take, for example, in the past for agriculture or an open grassland for raising stocks. And they charge people in using that. And those people who traditionally use the grassland for free now have to pay, and they will have a very, very different view on that. So of course, they will resist those charging systems, and it will stir up so-called political troubles. So in fact, the research and the study of common pool resources originated in the developing countries in which many of those common resources are being shared and owned traditionally by a group of people, so that they have collective ownership. But when so-called capitalism invades their countries, so there are many those common property being turned into private property, and people who traditionally rely on their common resources for living have to suffer. So it stirred up a lot of sort of trouble on that. Sometimes this kind of change is, I would say, that malevolent, because the local government want to sell the land and in return for revenue. But sometimes it is out of goodwill, because if nobody is responsible for the upkeeping of those common resources, the common resources will deplete very quickly. So that's why they need somebody to take care of that. So if you need somebody to take care of that, perhaps you may not opt for a good solution. Rather, you will have an alternative solution. So the alternative solution is exactly the focus of research and also the development of practical program in managing those common resources. So to set up some institution on that. The institution is not owned by an individual or a corporation, but usually being owned collectively, so that the institution have sort of several aspects we need to discuss. One is the institution have a constitutional aspect, what we call the constitutional institution. It also have a collective choice, so-called institutions, so that people can make choice on that. And the other is what we call the operational institution, which I will discuss it one by one. But what do we mean by institution? Institutions are not just organizations. Of course, organization is one form of institution, but institution can exist even without organization, because institutions are what we refer as formal rules or informal constraints on people's behavior. So if you set up institution, you can produce the collective good, but less dependent on those who are altruistic. So less dependent on altruists is one solution to collective action dynamic. Remember that critical mass is one solution to collective action that depends on individuals' motivation. So people who are altruistic to produce collective action can produce collective good, but if those people do not exist, there won't be any collective good. But an institution can turn this around. I think for an example, if owner organization is such an institution, then either it depends on a number of enthusiastic so-called owners to volunteer to run the organization, or otherwise, like many similar owners organization, if nobody are willing to run the organization will not exist. So that's why in what we call the three nose buildings in Hong Kong, there is no organization, because nobody wants to set it up, nobody wants to maintain that. But if you have some kind of implicit rule on that, it may not be that sort of formal, that perhaps we can take turn to run the organization. So everybody take 1 year or even half a year or 2 years to run that. Everybody have to run that. Everybody is equal, so you have fair chance of running that, and also you can have fair chance of taking a rest for a few years before you resume your duty. So the duty roster can be a solution, and that is some kind of institution. And an institution will also guarantee a minimal level of collective action. So even that collective action solution may not be the optimal, but at least the organization exists. And something similar is with the students' organization in universities. Because every year, the leadership of that student organization, they implicitly have that responsibility to look for somebody to succeed their post. And the freshmen are in university, many of them also have this kind of concept that they need to perhaps experience leadership in at least one student organization during their study in undergrad years. So if this way, at least we can guarantee somebody who will fill up the leadership, so to keep the organization running. Although there's no guarantee the organization will run in a very good way, but at least it exists. So that is some kind of institution that's set up by expectation. Constitutional institutions are the rules that set the boundary. who are eligible, who are involved, and also who have the right to set up the rules. So this is perhaps the first decision an institution has to make. Take, for example, an owners organization. We define those eligible are those who own the property. But why we do not include those who live in the property, but who do not own that? That is possible, but it's a constitutional decision. In Hong Kong, in mainland China, the owners organization only include those who own the property or formally own that property. Whereas in other countries, they will also include residents as well. So even if you're a renter, you have the legitimate right to be involved in those organizations, including voting, including being elected. And even you are not eligible, some constitution will allow the renter to be involved. So in fact, in Hong Kong, in the law for property management, the building management ordinance, they have a clause that will allow the tenants to be involved, although they are not members of the owners organization, but they could be involved with a representative on that sort of decision-making body. So that is the sort of practice in Hong Kong and in mainland China. And also involved are the management agents in that constitution. Whereas after deciding, making a decision on who is involved, who form the basis of the decision making, but still we need to have a decision making mechanism. How decisions are made in those organizations. It includes any procedure in setting up the organization, any procedure in making important decisions, or any procedure in making daily decisions. Take an example of Hong Kong. So the collective choice institution we have sort of created a low threshold of shareholders in that owners organization as low as 30%. So 30% of the share can initiate to set up an owners corporation. And important decision making have to be made in an annual general meeting. And there is a quorum for for those meetings, which are also at the level of collective choice, so institution. Whereas in Hong Kong, that threshold is being set at very low level. So the quorum for those annual general meeting and any important meeting to make important decision can be as low as 10%. And within that meeting, you only require a simple majority. So as many decisions are being made by 5% of the owners who attended either in person or by proxy to that meeting. But that collective decision institution will require all owners to comply with those decisions that are made legally within those meetings. If all these conditions on quorum and threshold of vote are satisfied. So you may say that 5% of the vote can control that the remaining 95% of owners who haven't participated in these meetings. And you also need to have operational institution to carry out the daily operation. Take, for example, who do what and who monitor whom, and also about the reward and sanction of that. When housing management is concerned, in fact, in Hong Kong and mainland China, we rely on the site management agent to do the day-to-day operation. But if the owner's corporation exists or the owner's organization exists, then the daily operation supervision will be borne by the management committee of the organization. Whereas in China, it's called the residence committee. The owner's committee, sorry, the owner's committee. So the owner's committee, the management committee will be charged with the responsibility of supervising or overseeing the daily management operation of the management agent. But they would not be involved in actually carry out the operations. And the reward and sanction, when housing management is concerned, is basically on the charging system and also for the remuneration of the property management agents. So I've mentioned earlier in the institutional basic organization setup that in Hong Kong, we practice very extensively what we call the manager remuneration system, that the property management agent will charge a fixed proportion of the total outgoing of the property. Whereas in mainland China, it's basically what we call an all-inclusive sort of system. An all-inclusive system is just like running a business. So it's a more typical entrepreneurial solution or corporate solution for the daily management. And also the sanction is being carried out by the management contract. So the management contract will specify what kind of services, the level, and also the standard, the quality, and that is being so controlled by the contract. But a more comprehensive so-called model for common good resources involve a lot of other considerations, more than the free institution we just set up, because there are a lot of factors that are being mentioned in the literature of common pool resources when you design the institution. We have no room to go into the details, but I just mentioned some of the models that are mentioned in the literature. Take for an example, there are a lot of sort of factors you have to take into account when you design that institution. It involves the economic environment, the political environment, the legal environment, and also technology. I'll come back later when we compare different institutional solutions of housing management. We will mention later. We'll compare the cooperative and the condominium system with such a framework. But let me briefly describe that framework first, because we need to take into consideration the research on common pool resources originated from the need of an institutional design in developing country in controlling and managing the natural resources, so that the economic environment has to be taken into account, because the economic environment will decide on the level of investment the user can bear, or the country can bear, if there is a change in the system of control in managing that common pool resources. We'll take for example, if you want to so-called privatize the land so that you can have a proper owner and proper agent of managing that land, for instance, the open grass. And that you have to consider the economic environment. So if your country is not rich, So you can imagine that if I privatize this land, nobody in your country have the resources to buy that land and control the resources. So very often, foreign company will step in and control the land. And in fact, that will create a lot of problem. And in fact, there is a problem, in fact, really exists in some African countries and being accused by people in that countries and also by some kind of critic in the West about Chinese company investing in some African country, buying off a big piece of land, either for the natural resources or just to sort of keep the land for agriculture. So that is the result of the country very eager to recover the revenue and also have a good, better exploitation and management of the natural resources. But this will trigger a problem if the economic environment in that country is not feasible for local enterprise to acquire those so-called land or resources, because that will trigger some political environment. The political environment will so-called trigger people whose benefit or interest being affected to complain and even to launch some resistance. So that, in fact, already happened in some African countries. So a political environment will also have to consider about collective ownership between different interest groups, because people or groups that use the resources of that land can belong to different tribes, different clans, or different interest groups. And politically, perhaps you need to balance the interest and use in designing those so-called institutional design. And you also need to consider the legal environment. The legal environment is whether law exists, or if you set up some rules to set up the institution, you need to set up new law, or the institution is contrary to existing law. I think an example from Hong Kong, because I mentioned there about the DMC. Now, DMC in Hong Kong is impossible to change, because the legal system in Hong Kong will take the DMC as a private contract, because it is initiated as a private contract signed between the developer and the first buyer, but it is mandatory to subsequent buyers. So if you allow the change of rules in changing clauses in the DMC without 100% consent, it may contradict with the contract laws in the common law. Of course, I mean, there are some way to resolve that, but how we can resolve that can not only take into consideration of the DMC change, but also its implication on the law of contract. And technology is another consideration, because you need to have the technology that can manage the resources. And take, for example, if you have the control that open sea fishing, do you have the technology to detect those intruders? Do you have the technology to patrol the open sea so that you can exclude those who are not eligible to fish in that particular area of the sea? So it also have to consider the resources characteristic. So the control of water resources may not be the same as the control of grassland. And of course, in the urban common resources, you have to have a different consideration. So you also have to make a consideration of the resources user, whether they are the farmers who use the land for farming, or it is those who keep their livestock who use the grassland around their farmland to feed their livestock. and also in the urban settings, whether the institution are for the upmarket so-called owners, or they are for those poorer people living in so-called very minimal standard housing, because it will affect the contribution they can make, and also their capacity in making decision or maintaining the institution. So there is a lot of those consideration on that. And all this take into consideration, you will determine or you will have an impact on how the resources are being used. So there is a number of so-called design principles, which I will not go in one by one, because basically it will take into consideration about the resources users on the rules, whether it's easy to monitor, whether it's easy to enforce the rules, or whether the sanction can be graduated so that people can adapt gradually to that control. Because setting up an institution will inevitably have an impact on people's behavior. But you cannot just have a very big lab from one end to the other without some graduating so-called adaptation to that. And in managing the natural resources in the developing country, perhaps it will involve some multiple level of government. So how you would so coordinate among those different levels, or do you need to have new procedure to revise the existing rule? So there is a lot of those sort of procedures. So we would say that the common pool resources approach is an alternative to either the state provision of public good or the market provision of local public good, the CUP good. There are many solutions. But unfortunately, common pool resources, theories, and models are sort of triggered by the concern for practical solutions. So they may not have a coherent base of so-called theory. In fact, that common pool resources has been there since the 1950s, but it's not becoming that popular until, I think, about 10 years ago, when the Nobel Prize of Economics was awarded to Elina Ostrom, a political scientist who was one of the advocates of that common pool resources. So the approach are becoming better known and more popular nowadays because of that Nobel Prize. So perhaps we will take a break of 5 minutes, and after the break, I'll try to employ some principle of the common pool resources approach in the discussion of an institutional solution to collective action dynamic in multifamily property ownership and management. So let's take a break of 5 minutes. So come back again in 5 minutes. So if you have any problem you would like to ask me, you can write it on the chat box so that I can address it after the break. Okay, let's continue. I'll continue on this institutional solution to collective action, taking the ownership and management of multifamily housing as an example. In considering the collective decision-making on common property, we need to consider two things that are the legal basis that are related. One is the law on properties, and the other is the law on association. Because setting up an organization will involve not just about the property, but also about how people form into organization. So usually it will touch on these two areas. In the literature, in fact, there are so-called many types of such organization or such institution on ownership and management. We will briefly describe two and describe another two in a little bit more detail. One type is what we call a tenants in common, how you own and manage a multifamily sort of property. And the other is what we call leaseholding. And the third one is called a cooperative, and the fourth one is a condominium. Tenants in common, in fact, are co-ownership. So that is a very common form of ownership in the 50s or before the 60s in Hong Kong, in multifamily housing in Hong Kong, which I already mentioned earlier, that if you want to own and manage the a multifamily housing, for instance, a block of building that have 8 or 10 units, you cannot, like now, you buy it one by one. You need to acquire the whole block. So if more than one people who want to share that block, you need to own it collectively. So the analogy is just like you buy a house, a husband and wife want to buy a house, or a father and daughter want to buy a house. They need to enter their names into the ownership, so the title. So that's what in legal terms in Hong Kong, what we call tenants in common. So they're not tenants, they're owners, but they have to commonly own their property. So all owners will hold the right of claim. Of course, you can divide up your share, but that is your own internal business. So there is no clearly identification of ownership and responsibility. Is a clear responsibility is just with the collective. Take, for example, 2 of you, 3 of you who like opening a company, and then the company buy the property. You have to buy it. But this kind of ownership is, it can resolve the collective action dynamic because it internalize the externality, because there is nothing called so-called cooperation when the owners are concerned, because there's just one owner. But with 10 owners, you split your share. So how you split, how you negotiate is totally your internal business. So that's why that from external people, there is nothing external. So because it's your internal business. So it offers a solution, but the solution is complicated if the scale of ownership is big. So if you have a property of 5 units, if you can have 5 owners who perhaps know each other, and then they collectively buy the property and share among themselves, and the responsibility of sharing of the cost of repaying maintenance being divided up among that sort of 5 owners, but they have to manage it by the private contract. So outside people do not have to patrol, do not have to set any rules. So you don't need any institution for that. But you can imagine that if there is 100 units or even 1,000 units, and this kind of solution is not effective at all. So that's why in the 60s, Hong Kong introduced what we call the condominium system, which we mention later, to solve this kind of transaction and ownership and management, so-called ineffectiveness. And the other solution is what we call a leasehold solution. The leasehold solution is exactly the same as the leasehold arrangement of land ownership and land use right. In Hong Kong, land, or also in mainland China, lands are owned by the government, by the state, but users can rent that land or to lease that land for a certain period. So I already mentioned that in the second lecture. So that is what we practice of leaseholding in land ownership and land use. But this can also apply to individual properties. So that is the case in the UK, in fact. In the UK, for instance, in London, most of the land in the near the central business area, like what we call the Zone 2 and Zone 3, the lands are being owned by rich families, have the origin of aristocracy. So they own the land, but they don't want to sell the land. Or if they want to develop multifamily property, they have an arrangement that they keep the ownership of land, but only sell off the user rights of the individual property or individual unit to small owners. So that is exactly the leasehold system of land I've just mentioned. So the landowner, the leaseholder, have to take the full responsibility of maintaining the land, fulfilling all the obligation regarding the land, and they will also take responsibility of daily management. Of course, I mean, they can so-called delegate those responsibility to a management agent in doing that. And because in the UK, there is no legal provision like Hong Kong and mainland China to sell individual units. And usually the landlord do not want to sell off the permanent rights of the land because they will expect the land value will depreciate in the future. So they will keep the land, but they want to recover the user cost of the land by selling off the land, their long lease. And the lease can be 50 years, 70 years, just like our land lease of Hong Kong and mainland China. So in fact, this is a form of corporate solution because the landlord is responsible to provide the services, but in return, they charge the individual owner the regular payment of management service. But of course, this has its own problem, which I will not mention in details. So in recent years, in fact, UK also have the leasehold reform because it all suffers from the problem we mentioned about couples. The imbalance of power, the difficulties of exclusion, of control. They have all those so-called problems, particularly about the imbalance of power. So the owners or the tenants, they cannot have the power to negotiate with the landlord. So they will put some kind of very unfavorable terms to the tenants or the owners. So it triggers some kind of concerns and some dissatisfaction among the unit owners. The two main, what we call the main sort of form of collective ownership and management is cooperative and condominium, which I'll discuss in more detail. But of course, around the world, condominium is far more popular than cooperative. So what is cooperative? Housing cooperative work in such a way. Take, for example, you are the owners of a property, or you want to be an owner of property. There is a multifamily property, and they will so-called sell off, quote unquote, to individual owners, just like what we are familiar with in Hong Kong, mainland China, US, Australia, in buying an apartment. So you buy the apartment unit. But instead of being classified as an owner or legally classified as an owner, in fact, those owners, they are also the shareholder of a organization called the housing cooperative. And the housing cooperative, in fact, fully own the property. So individual owners, as a shareholder, they have exclusive right of their own individual unit as a tenant. So they rent the property, their unit, apartment unit, from the owners cooperative, in which they are a shareholder. So they own the organization, and the organization own the property, and you rent the property from the organization. So the cooperative can also appoint a manager or management agent to take care of that, so that the decision making is being done by the cooperative. Why a cooperative is so-called popular or possible? Because there are some advantage of the cooperative, because the cooperative is an organization, and the conception is you are not in fact the owner of your apartment unit, but you are a member or shareholder of the organization. So you first belong to the organization, and then the organization will build and manage the property. So then you have shared responsibility before individual responsibility. And more important, in some countries that cooperative are popular, for instance, in Sweden, cooperative, the organization, cooperative, take out the mortgage, but not the individual owner. The individual owner will pay the rent, and the cooperative will use the rent they collected to pay for the mortgage. Although the sum are not this, will be exactly the same, even if you take out the mortgage by the individual owner. But the consequences is there's a risk sharing, because if the risk is borne by the collective, the cooperative, you share the risk. So the risk of the financial institution to provide the mortgage will be lower, because even if one member of the cooperative encountered some financial difficulties and was unable to pay the rent, because you have a large number of shareholders, perhaps they can share the rent temporarily so that the mortgage will not get in default. So that is safer, in fact, from the perspective of the financer. So if the risk is lower, then the mortgage rate will be lower. And also the cooperative is the organization which will take responsibility of management and maintenance. And in fact, in the case of Sweden, they even have sort of collective purchase of some utility, so that the tenant, that's the owner, can benefit. Take, for example, if they need to retrofit the kitchen, just an analogy is just like you are public tenant in public housing. So you do not have to take care of the retrofitting if your kitchen needs to be sort of modernized. The cooperative will do collective purchase and arrange all those so-called retrofitting for you. But of course, I mean, that decision is made collectively by all owners in the collective. So you do not have to bother about that. And because of that bulk purchase, usually you get a better price. You get a better price. But more importantly, that shared responsibility is being translated into a sense of community. And that is also why in Sweden, that cooperative is popular, because that cooperative, in fact, started in the 1930s and becoming more popular in the 50s and 60s, because Sweden is a country that will treasure collective sentiment more than individual sentiment. So that's why they promote that. And then cooperative has become very popular in Sweden. In fact, in Sweden, until about 10 years ago, if you want to develop multifamily housing, cooperative was the only organization form that is permitted. Condominium is not permitted in Sweden until about 10 to 15 years ago. In fact, in Hong Kong, there are a lot of condominiums started in the 50s. So in the heydays, in the 60s, in fact, we have over 2,000 housing cooperative in Hong Kong. So now the housing cooperative also occupy some headlines in the news on real estate, because they are now very old, they're 60, 70 years old, and you need to be redeveloped. But redeveloping housing cooperative is a little bit more complicated than developing condominium, because that cooperative is being held, the property is being held by cooperative, an organization. So you need to deal with the organization. So you need to have a decision within the organization so that you dissolve the organization and apply to convert it into condominium before you can engage with the developer for redevelopment. So it appears to be very complicated. But in fact, there are still around more than 1,000 units of cooperative in Hong Kong. Many of them occupy prime areas in the urban area. This one is in Tokau 1, and this one is in near Sandy Bay in the Hong Kong Island, which are areas of upmarket residential development. And in fact, surprisingly, cooperative is also popular in New York City. So in fact, many of the multifamily property in New York City are cooperative. So you may not know that, in fact, the most expensive and upmarket apartment facing the Central Park in New York City, overwhelming majority of them are cooperative. So cooperative has been a dominant form in New York City and also in other big US cities as well. But cooperative ideas is not that popular worldwide, except in a few countries. In Sweden, in Denmark, and also in Scotland, but not popular elsewhere, because cooperative cannot compete with what we call an individualistic so-called view of holding property. People are more selfish, they want individual gain rather than collective gain. And also they will treasure more on the exchange value, that is the value that you recover from selling the property, than use value. Because when you sell the individual property in cooperative, you cannot directly sell the property. You can only sell the property back to the cooperative. So you may say that the supply and demand would not be that big, or the market will not get that big. Compared with condominium, that your condominium unit can be sold to a large number of potential buyers. Whereas in condominium system, you cannot sell it in the open market. You can only sell it in back to the cooperative. So you can imagine that the cooperative may not be willing to use it to bid for a high price to buy back your property. And in fact, share risk is something good if you expect you will encounter financial difficulties. But share risk will not be good for those who want to maximize the value appreciation of their property. And also, buying and selling in cooperative can be complicated because it involves an organization. So in fact, in New York City and also in Hong Kong, that buying and selling that cooperative property are not welcomed by real estate agents. Whereas in New York, it's the opposite. Although it's complicated, but the residents, in fact, can choose their neighbors. So that's why they can keep the profiles of the members of cooperative in order to control the incoming tenants of nearly the same class and same taste as their members. And in this way, in fact, they can keep the value of the property in such a way. Condominium operate in a slightly different way from the cooperative. So that's easy to understand because the system of Hong Kong and mainland China are condominium. So your owner of a property, in fact, you buy and sell your individual property. So the individual property is your own property. Whereas you need to be a member of the owners association. The owners association will only be responsible to own and manage the common area or share facilities. But in fact, a condominium in its pure form or ideal form should compose of three what we call inextricable elements. So you need to have these three elements all exist at the same time. So these are the individual ownership of the apartment unit, the common ownership of the land and the common part facilities, and membership of an individual owners organization. So joint ownership is important because there's no way, in fact, you can control the property, the land and the share facility, unless you collectively or jointly own those parts. But what we mean by joint ownership is the entitlement is collective. So you cannot have exclusive ownership of any specific part outside your individual unit. And also you cannot sell the share in the common part. And because it's jointly owned, you can use that, but you cannot exclude other people in using that. And also that share cannot be separated from the ownership of your individual apartment unit. The second is an organization. So in fact, you need an organization to realize the ownership rights and also to discharge the daily management responsibility. But how you distribute or how you set up the organization, the decision-making mechanism vary. So in Hong Kong, it's by share. Whereas in mainland China, in Taiwan, it's both share and also head count when you have to make the decision. But how the vote is being counted vary, because in Hong Kong, it depends on the DMC. It can be on equal share, it can be on size, it can be on value, or it can be on other formula which may not be that explicit. Whereas in the property management law in mainland China, they have a different sort of requirement for that. So they count both the share and also count the head count of owners, because they do not want the decision to be dominated by the major so-called shareholders in that organization. And that is also the practice in Taiwan as well. Whereas that's also important to have an agreement. So the agreement is the rule for the organization. So in Hong Kong is the DMC, in mainland China is the owner's contract. So it can be based on legislation or based on mutual agreement. Whereas in Hong Kong, it's purely a mutual agreement, whereas the DMC is being drafted by the developers. Whereas in mainland China, you have some kind of template within the property management law that will dictate how that agreement can be drafted. Whereas in Hong Kong, the DMC is also being obliged to follow the clauses in the land grant, so that the condition of the land grant will pass off to subsequent buyers. And the law and the regulation that will sort of dictate the daily operation and also the decision-making law can either be originated from the law from law of the state or from the government. Take, for example, in many countries that have extensive condominiums like Australia, Singapore, and some states in the United States, they have a specific law, what we call the strata title law or the condominium law, that will circumscribe what kind of regulation you can put into that so-called daily operations or into the mutual contract. In Hong Kong, that is scattered in different so-called legislations. So you can have the title deed. You can also have the DMC, which are partly being circumscribed by the building management ordinance, but many of them are in fact outside the jurisdiction of the BMO, and you can set it. So usually it's the developer who set it. Whereas in mainland China is being circumscribed by the property management laws requirement. But Housg and some organization of owners organization, the owners corporation in Hong Kong, the owners assembly in mainland China, they in sort of real practice, they suffer from a lot of problems. Particularly the problem of what we call the private government and power imbalance. And that is also the problem that have been mentioned in the literature of the situation in Australia and also in the United States. Because the owners organization as a solution for collective action dynamic, either as a coupled solution in the organization membership system or in the CPR as an organization to provide common goods, they provide local services within a particular locality. And in some way, they act as private government, because within the locality, most of the rules of the city do not apply or apply to a lesser extent. Particularly in the jurisdiction that develop large-scale condominium, so that the condominium would not only provide housing, but also other public services. So that is particularly explicit in many big private development in Hong Kong and in mainland China. So large areas are being fenced off, gated, and within the area, all the public services are provided by the property management agent. So it is just like a de facto private government. So they can even set up their own rules and exercise power control over their members. And in the United States, in many states, they can even set up rules for enforcement, some kind of fining system. And that is not possible in Hong Kong and mainland China, but you can only enforce that rule through the court. But whereas in some states, in some cities in the United States, you can even set up a fining system on members who do not comply with the decision of the owners' organization. So they have system of legislation and execution as if they are a local private government, which is outside the control of the democratic system. So in fact, the owners' organization, with the principle of design from the common pool resources, should be democratic. Because you need to have a decision-making mechanism that will mimic the democratic decision-making political system. So that is usually you have equality of vote and everybody have the responsibility and also the obligation to elect, to vote and be elected. And although in some way it's linked to shareholder, but that stakeholder is being linked to the system as if it is a economic democracy. And it's also a voluntary organization because you cannot force people to participate. So the participation is all voluntary, and you can say that it's a form of socialism in some way, because within those organizations, you seldom will pin down the responsibility of sharing the cost to a very detailed calculation of the frequency and intensity of use. So regardless whether you use the lift service very extensively, whether you live on the ground floor or live on the top floor, you pay the same sort of charge towards the maintenance of the lift. So it's a socialist system. Although in some proposal in mainland China, they advocate another system that will link the usage to the charging system, but it never take root to implement. So you may say that because of that participation, and it's easy for you to establish the sense of community. Not to mention that the cooperative setup is exactly targeting those goals in installing a sense of community. And some commentators even escalate the democratic element in homeowners organization. It's some form of associative democracy. So in democracy, we always mention about two extreme forms. One is what we call the representative democracy, just like the system of the US and the UK, that you cast a vote and you elect your representative to represent you to make political decisions. Whereas in extreme is they will encourage the participation of individual voters in decision making. So just like Switzerland, every quarters they have sort of referendum to make decision by the individual voter on some very important sort of policy of the country. So there is some kind of participatory decision making that you do not rely on your representative, and you make the decision on each of front of you. So that's also the practice in many local government in the United States as well. So they cast a vote of referendum to vote for a particular policy. So sometimes that referendum can have tens or 20 agenda you need to make a decision. Whereas association democracy is something in between. So that if you're a member of a medium-sized organization, that the organization is small enough to have direct participation. And then you can a democracy, the democratic decision through the organization. So it can be overcoming the inefficiency of both the representative democracy and participatory democracy. But unfortunately, in fact, many such organizations, they are not that ideal. Although in terms of design, they are democratic. But in real practice, because of the unequal participation, so some people may hold more power. So it turned out to be repressive, particularly, for instance, like in Hong Kong, the consideration of efficiency will push the government to delegate the power of setting up the DMC by the developer. And that is also the practice, in fact, in many other jurisdictions of condominium system. But then the power of the developer are much, much more than the individual owners. And if it's easy to change the rule, that may not be a problem, because then you can exercise democratic practice to ratify that. But like the case in Hong Kong, that is very, very difficult or even impossible to change the rule. So the organization may change into a repressive regime. So the responsibility of participation, of shared responsibility, may just be sort of boiled down into some kind of economic obligation, paying the management fee and also to keep the property value, but not the so-called more community responsibility and obligation. And I just mentioned that this repressive regime are usually dominated by the developer. And that's not just the case in Hong Kong. In fact, in United States and also in Australia, in mainland China, that's also the issue as well. So it creates a lot of power imbalance, as I just mentioned. So it's easy for a small group of people who are being elected in the owners committees, in the management committee, to manipulate the procedures, the decision making, so that they create a lot of power imbalance. And in fact, the law in many jurisdictions are silent or even murky on that. So it's not that clear, it's confused. They acknowledge that, but they don't want to do something on that, because otherwise it seems to deter people from participation. So let me have a very quick summary of the comparison of the two organization forms in multifamily housing, on condominium, and also on cooperative. So in both the condominium and cooperative, in fact, there's a high degree of jointness in service provision. And also, it's possible to exclude individual units, or to exclude what we call non-payment of costs to reproduce the services. But the difference between cooperative and condominium is the boundary in condominium is very clear. So you have the private area owned by the unit owners, and you have the common areas owned by the owners organization. Whereas the cooperative is not that clear cut, because in theories or in legal terms, the organization will also have ownership claim on the individual apartment unit. But sometimes in practice, it's not that clear cut, because unless it is a pure rental property, otherwise it is not that reasonable, in fact, to interfere into the operation of the apartment owners in changing the internal declaration or facility within the unit. And in practice, in fact, it depends. So in terms of ownership system, they are in condominium, it's very clear about individual units and the common part, but in cooperative, it's less clear. In fact, in legal terms, as I just mentioned, that the individual unit is also owned by the cooperative. And decision making, the difference between the condominium and the cooperative is the cooperative can have the power to make a decision on who can enter the multifamily development, housing development. Because you cannot buy and sell your property. You can only acquire the property through joining the cooperative member. And joining the cooperative member, you need the agreement or the approval of the cooperative, which sometimes are being decided by all members. So that is the practice I mentioned in the upmarket apartment buildings facing the Central Park in New York City. And in terms of sharing, in condominium, the sharing is very restricted, just to the common area. Whereas in the cooperative, it's quite intensive. And there is also a very big difference between the ideology of the two organizations. In condominiums, they are purely business consideration. The organization run like a business corporation, whereas in cooperative is run from the ideology of a citizen movement. So they put more emphasis on creating, enhancing the sense of belonging to the condominium, and then to maintain a sense of community, so that they will organize a lot of activities, a lot of bulk purchase, collective purchase, so that you can maintain the relations among the members of cooperative. But if you compare the management effectiveness of cooperative and condominium in Hong Kong, you can make a marked difference. And these are the photos I took about 15 years ago when I did a research comparing cooperative and condominiums in Hong Kong. So they are in the same district, in close vicinity. On the right side is condominium. On the left side is cooperative. They are more or less of the same age, but you can instantaneously differentiate the level of upkeeping in condominium and cooperative. So you may say that in terms of upkeeping, the cooperative is much more superior than condominium. But of course, in keeping the house value of your property, condominium would fare much better than cooperative. So perhaps I will skip this of some kind of so-called matching the design principle of condominium and cooperative in that. So you can revisit that when I share this presentation. So today we have mentioned about the common pool resources approach in designing an institutional solution to collective action, so-called dynamic, in the fields of multifamily, housing ownership, and management. Although I've just mentioned that we can slightly match the principles of common pool resources to that design, but because of the not having a coherent and unified so-called body of theories in the condominium, in the common pool resources approach. So we can just use some very general principle in the institutional design to match with the organization so-called solution to multifamily so-called housing development. And specifically, we will compare the cooperative and condominium, whereas condominiums is a dominant form of multifamily housing ownership, both in Hong Kong, mainland China, in many English-speaking countries. So on that, we have covered the institutional setup and also the economic side of collective action dynamic. But multifamily housing and collective action also have a political dimension, which we will use the example of the owners organization in China as an example, which I will elaborate in the next lecture. So before that, if you have any problem and issue, you can either write it down in the chat room or send me an email so that I can revisit that in next lecture. And sorry for overrunning for a few minutes. So perhaps see you next week on that socio-political implication of owners organization in mainland China. Okay, until then, goodbye.